Silence is a funny thing. It can be a shield, or it can be a weapon. For 4 years, my brother used it as both. But yesterday, a courier arrived with a single wax-sealed envelope from a high-profile law firm. I expected a threat. I expected a demand. Instead, I opened it, read the first 3 lines, and I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat on my floor and laughed until my lungs burned. Because after 4 years of trying to ruin me, my brother had finally handed me the one thing he swore I'd never have: the truth. My name is Lily Rose, and for a long time, that name felt like a weight I couldn't carry. They say blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood is also a lot messier to clean up. 4 years ago, I walked away from everything: my family, my inheritance, and the suffocating shadow of my older brother, Julian. I left with nothing but a suitcase and a bruised ego, settling into a life of quiet anonymity. No phone calls, no holiday cards, just a cold, hard void where a family used to be. I thought I had won the war of silence. I thought that by disappearing, I had taken away Julian's power to hurt me. I was wrong. Silence wasn't his surrender. It was his preparation. It was a Tuesday when the doorbell rang. The rain was drumming against my window, a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the ticking of the clock in my hallway. Standing there was a man in a charcoal suit, looking entirely too expensive for my neighborhood. He didn't say much. He just handed me a legal-sized envelope, asked for a digital signature, and vanished back into the gray mist. The return address made my heart drop into my stomach. Miller and Associates. That was Julian's law firm. Not just the firm he used, the firm he basically owned through a web of shell companies and donations. My hands were shaking as I walked back into my kitchen. I stared at that white paper for a long time, the steam from my tea rising to meet the cold air. Was this a lawsuit? A final cease and desist from existing? Or maybe, just maybe, it was the final blow he'd been saving up. I grabbed a butter knife and sliced the top of the envelope. My breath was hitched in my throat. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored bond paper. No legal jargon, no whereas or heretofore, just a handwritten note attached to a photocopied bank ledger from 1998. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, the fear was gone. It was replaced by a wave of pure, unfiltered absurdity. I looked at the empty chair across from me and started to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a giggle, and the giggle turned into a full-blown hysterical laugh that echoed off the walls of my tiny apartment. Julian, the man who prided himself on being the smartest person in any room, had just made a mistake so massive, so blindingly stupid, that it didn't just bridge the 4-year gap between us. It burned the bridge down while he was still standing on it. He thought this document would finish me. He thought this would be the final nail in my coffin. He had no idea that he had just handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. I leaned back, wiping a tear of laughter from my eye, and looked at the date on the ledger. "Oh, Julian," I whispered to the empty room, "you really shouldn't have sent this." The laughter eventually died down, leaving a heavy, electric silence in the kitchen. I spread the document out on the counter, smoothing the creases with my palm as if it were a map to a buried treasure. In a way, it was. Julian had always been obsessed with his legacy. He viewed our family history not as a story, but as a brand to be managed. To him, I was a glitch in the software, a variable he couldn't control. When he pushed me out 4 years ago, he told the world I was unstable, that I had squandered my portion of the family estate on frivolous ventures. He played the grieving, protective brother so well that even our old family friends stopped taking my calls. But this document, this changed everything. It was a photocopy of a private ledger from our father's personal holdings, dated October 12, 1998. That was the year our father passed away. At the time, I was barely 10 years old, and Julian was 21, ready to step into the throne. My eyes locked onto a specific line item, highlighted in a fate-aged yellow. It was a trust fund entry. Not for Julian. Not for me. It was for a third entity, a name I had never heard in my entire life. Project Primrose. Below it, in our father's distinct, shaky handwriting, was a note. For Lily's protection, should the lion ever grow too hungry. The irony was delicious. Julian had sent this to me as a threat. He had included a cover letter from his lawyer stating that this document proved I had already received a secret payout as a child, and therefore I had no legal right to sue for my remaining inheritance now. He thought he was closing a loophole. Instead, he was showing me the loophole existed. He didn't realize that Project Primrose wasn't a payout. I knew my father's codes. He loved gardening, and a primrose was a flower that bloomed in the cold, often representing a hidden strength. If Dad had set aside a Primrose account, it wasn't a bank account I had already emptied. It was a contingency plan, a safety net buried so deep in the corporate structure of the Rose Group that even Julian hadn't been able to touch it for 25 years. Julian must have found the reference in an old archive and assumed it was evidence of my greed. He was so blinded by his desire to keep me away from his money that he didn't stop to think why our father would hide something from him. I grabbed my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys. For 4 years I had been Lily Rose, the girl who gave up. Tonight, I was Lily Rose, the girl who was going to look through the cracks of a dead man's empire. I started digging into the Rose Group's public filings from the late 90s. If Primrose existed, it would be hidden under layers of boring, bureaucratic shell companies. An hour passed, then 2. Outside, the rain turned into a downpour, mimicking the flood of data crossing my screen. A small, defunct holding company registered in Delaware. Primrose Path LLC. Status: active. Assets: undisclosed. Signatory: Lily Rose. Pending verification. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julian had just handed me the one piece of paper I needed to prove my identity to a company he didn't even know he didn't own. He had spent 4 years making sure I had no voice. And with one arrogant, misguided legal move, he had just handed me a megaphone. I looked at the lawyer's letter again. The signature at the bottom wasn't just a partner at the firm, it was Julian's personal fixer. This wasn't just business. This was a mistake born of pure, unadulterated ego. I picked up my phone, a device that hadn't seen a family contact in years. I didn't call Julian. That would be too easy. I called the one person Julian feared more than any judge or auditor. Our Aunt Martha, the woman who held the tie-breaking vote on the board of directors, and a woman who valued family honor above all else. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was like ice. "Lily, you shouldn't be calling this number." "I know, Auntie," I said, my voice steady, a smirk playing on my lips. "But Julian just sent me a gift, and I think you'd be very interested to see what's inside the box." Aunt Martha's house always smelled like expensive sandalwood and old secrets. It was a fortress of mahogany and silence, located just far enough outside the city to feel like a separate kingdom. When I arrived, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was biting. She didn't greet me with a hug. She didn't even stand up. She sat in her high-backed velvet chair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, and gestured for me to sit across from her. 4 years, Lily," she said, her eyes scanning me like a hawk looking for a weakness. "You look tired." Poverty doesn't suit the Rose name. "I'm not here for a loan, Martha," I replied, pulling the envelope from my bag. I didn't hand it to her yet. "I'm here because Julian is losing his mind, or his grip. Possibly both." I watched her expression. Martha was the gatekeeper of the family legacy. If Julian was the king, she was the one who forged the crown. She had supported my exile because Julian convinced her I was a liability, a loose cannon who would embarrass the firm. "Julian is the CEO," she said flatly. "He has expanded our margins by 12% this year. He isn't losing anything." "He's getting sloppy," I countered. I slid the photocopy of the 1998 ledger across the table. "He sent me this, through his private lawyers. He wanted to use it to intimidate me into signing away my remaining rights to the estate." Martha adjusted her glasses and looked at the paper. At first, she looked bored. Then she saw the handwriting. She saw the highlight. She saw the name. Project Primrose. The silence that followed was different from the silence in my kitchen. This was a heavy, suffocating quiet. Martha's hand, usually as steady as a surgeon's, trembled just a fraction as she set the paper back down. "He sent this to you?" she whispered. "To you?" "He didn't know what it was," I said, leaning forward. He thought it was just a record of a secret payment. He thought he was proving I'd been paid off under the table when I was a kid. He has no idea what Dad was actually doing. Martha stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening gardens. Your father was a paranoid man, Lily. He knew Julian was ambitious. He knew Julian had a certain ruthlessness that didn't account for family loyalty. He created Primrose Path as a kill switch. If Julian ever tried to completely dismantle the family structure, or push you out entirely, that account would trigger a massive shift in voting shares. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew it was a safety net, but I didn't realize it was a weapon. By sending you this, Martha continued, turning back to me, Julian has legally acknowledged the existence of the very document he spent years trying to suppress in court. He's admitted, in writing, that this ledger is a valid part of the estate record. He just handed you the legal standing to demand an audit of Primrose Path. And if I demand that audit? I asked. Martha gave me a grim, thin-lipped smile. If you demand that audit, and it is revealed that Julian has been using company funds to cover the fact that Primrose Path's shares have been missing for a decade, he won't just lose the CEO chair. He'll be lucky if he doesn't end up in a federal cell. I sat back, the weight of the situation finally hitting me. Julian hadn't just made a mistake. He had accidentally handed me the detonator to his own life. He's coming for you, you know, Martha warned. The moment he realizes what he's done, the moment his lawyers tell him that you didn't sign the waiver, he will stop being a businessman. He will become a cornered animal. Let him, I said, feeling a surge of confidence I hadn't felt in years. I've spent 4 years in the dark. I'm quite used to the shadows. It's Julian who's afraid of the light. I left Martha's house with a new sense of purpose. But as I pulled out of her long driveway, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. They stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind me, turning when I turned, slowing when I slowed. The lion was hungry. The headlights behind me weren't a coincidence. They were a statement. I took a sharp left into a crowded gas station, hoping the bright fluorescent lights and the presence of witnesses would buy me a moment to think. The black SUV followed, idling at the edge of the lot like a gargoyle made of metal and glass. They weren't hiding anymore. Julian wanted me to know that the peaceful phase of our estrangement was officially over. I pulled out my phone. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but my mind was strangely clear. I didn't call the police, not yet. In the Rose family, the police were a last resort, and Julian had half the precinct on his payroll anyway. Instead, I opened the camera app and took a clear photo of the SUV's license plate. Then, I did something Julian would never expect. I got out of the car. I walked straight toward the SUV. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing a man I recognized instantly. Marcus, Julian's head of security, which was really just a fancy title for a professional bully. Lily, Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, you've had a busy night. Mr. Rose thinks it's time you came home for a chat. Tell Julian that home is a place where people don't send lawyers to threaten their sisters, I said, leaning against his door. I held up the envelope. And tell him I'm keeping the gift he sent. It's the most honest thing he's ever given me. Marcus didn't blink. He's not asking, Lily. He's offering a settlement. One last chance to walk away with enough money to never work again. You just have to sign the acknowledgement for the 1998 ledger and go back into the shadows. I laughed, and this time it sounded sharp, like breaking glass. He's terrified, isn't he? He realized he sent me the Primrose key, and now he's trying to buy the lock back. The answer is no, Marcus. Tell him I'll see him at the board meeting on Friday. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, my skin crawling, expecting a hand on my shoulder at any second. But Marcus stayed in the SUV. He knew as well as I did that Julian couldn't afford a public kidnapping. Not yet. I drove home via the longest route possible, weaving through narrow back streets until the headlights finally vanished. When I got inside my apartment, I locked every bolt and pushed a heavy chair against the door. I didn't sleep. I spent the night at my desk, drafting an email to the firm's lead auditor. I attached a scan of the document Julian's own lawyers had sent me. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for an apology. I simply asked a single devastating question. If these funds were paid to me in 1998, as my brother's counsel claims, Why does the Rose Group's annual tax filing still list Primrose Path as an untouchable act of trust in my name? It was a checkmate. Julian had claimed the money was gone to keep me from it, but the company's books said the money was still there to avoid a tax audit. He had created two different realities, and by sending me that document, he had forced them to collide. By 6:00 a.m., my inbox pinged. It wasn't the auditor, it was a direct message from Julian's personal, encrypted account. Lily, stop this now. You don't know what you're playing with. You think you found a secret, but you've only found a debt. If you open that door, we both go down. I stared at the screen. He was pivoting, from threats to a partnership in destruction. It was his classic move. If he couldn't beat you, he'd try to make his failure your fault. But I wasn't 10 years old anymore. I wasn't the little girl crying in the hallway while he took over our father's office. I typed back 4 words, "See you on Friday." I hit send and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For 4 years I had been running. Now for the first time, I was the one standing still, and the world was rushing to catch up with me. Part 5. The Glass Tower. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I didn't dress like a fugitive. I wore a tailored, charcoal suit I'd kept from my old life, and I did my hair in the sharp, precise style my father used to admire. I wasn't just Lily Rose, the estranged sister. I was a shareholder entering her territory. The headquarters of the Rose Group was a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the very clouds of the city. As I walked through the lobby, the security guards, men who used to nod at me every morning, looked away, eyes glued to their monitors. Julian had scrubbed my name from the directory, but he couldn't scrub me from their memories. I didn't head for the CEO's office. I headed for the boardroom on the 44th floor. When the elevator doors hissed open, I was met with a wall of tension. The mahogany doors to the boardroom were closed, but I could hear the muffled roar of voices inside. I didn't knock. I pushed the doors open and walked in. The room went silent. 12 of the most powerful people in the industry sat around a table that cost more than my apartment building. Julian was at the head, looking immaculate in a navy suit, though the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed him. Aunt Martha sat to his right, her face an unreadable mask of stone. "Lily," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk but cold as a grave. "This is a private meeting. Security will escort you out." "Actually, Julian," I said, walking to the foot of the table and dropping a heavy folder onto the polished wood. "As a primary beneficiary of the Primrose Path Trust, a trust your own legal team validated just 3 days ago, I have a mandatory seat at this table during any discussion regarding the restructuring of family assets." One of the board members, an older man named Mr. Sterling, frowned. "Primrose Path. Julian, you told us that account was liquidated years ago to cover Lily's debts." "He lied," I said, not taking my eyes off my brother. "He didn't just lie to me. He lied to all of you. He used the liquidation of those shares to consolidate his voting power, but according to the ledger he so graciously sent me, those shares were never moved. They were hidden." Julian's face went from pale to a dangerous mottled red. "That document was a draft, Lily, a mistake by a junior clerk. It holds no legal weight." "Then why did your personal fixer follow me for 3 days trying to get me to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding that mistake?" I asked. "And why did the firm's auditors just flag a $12 million discrepancy in the offshore accounts tied to that specific ledger?" The room exploded. Board members began shouting, leaning over their tablets and demanding answers. Julian leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "You think you're winning?" he hissed, low enough so only I could hear. "You're destroying the company. If I go down, the Rose name goes with me. You'll be the queen of a pile of ashes." "I'd rather have ashes than your version of a kingdom, Julian," I replied. Aunt Martha finally spoke, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Julian, sit down. Lily, show the board the original signature on that bank ledger." I opened the folder, but as I pulled out the document, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the dim light of my kitchen. On the back of the photocopy, there was a fake timestamp from a fax machine. The date wasn't from 1998. It was from 2 weeks ago. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't an old document Julian had found. This was something someone had created recently to lure me out. I looked at Julian. He looked genuinely confused. Then I looked at Martha. She was looking at the clock on the wall. The audit isn't just about Julian, is it, Martha? I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The door to the boardroom opened again. Not security. It was the federal authorities. And they weren't looking for Julian. They were looking for the person who had been signing the Primrose checks for the last 20 years. The air in the room turned to ice. The federal agents moved with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. Julian stood up, his hands raised instinctively. But the lead agent walked right past him. They stopped at the head of the table, but they didn't look at the CEO. They looked at the woman who had truly held the strings for decades. Martha Rose, the agent said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. You are under investigation for the systematic embezzlement of the Primrose Trust and the falsification of corporate records dating back to 1999. I felt the world tilt. Julian turned to our aunt, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Martha, what is he talking about? Martha didn't panic. She didn't even flinch. She simply took a slow sip of her tea, set the porcelain cup down with a delicate clink, and looked at me. I told you your father was paranoid, Lily, but he wasn't paranoid about Julian. He was paranoid about me. He knew I was the one with the mind for the business. He knew I was the one who actually built this empire while he played in his gardens. She looked at Julian with genuine pity. Julian was the perfect distraction, arrogant, loud, and so obsessed with his own power that he never noticed the foundations shifting beneath him. I sent you that document, Lily, not Julian. You sent it? I stammered. I needed a catalyst, she said calmly. The auditors were closing in. I needed someone to take the blame, and I needed a public family feud to explain the sudden movement of funds. I thought if I lured you back with the promise of Primrose, you and Julian would tear each other apart in court, providing the perfect smokescreen for me to exit with the remaining assets. She smiled, a cold, predatory thing, but I underestimated your sense of humor, Lily. If you hadn't laughed, if you hadn't questioned the absurdity of that single document, you would have walked right into the trap I set. You were supposed to sue Julian, not trigger a federal audit of the entire holding structure. As the agents led her out, the boardroom felt strangely empty. Julian slumped back into his chair, looking like a man who had just realized he'd been playing a game of checkers while the person next to him was playing 4D chess. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. Lily, I didn't know. I swear, I thought I was just protecting the firm from you. You weren't protecting anything, Julian, I said, picking up the 1998 ledger, the piece of paper that had started it all. You were just a pawn in a much older game. I walked out of that glass tower and didn't look back. I didn't want the throne. I didn't want the Primrose millions, which were now tied up in a decade of legal battles. I had something better. I had the truth, and I had my life back. As I walked into the crisp evening air, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The silence of the last 4 years was finally over, but this time, the silence was mine to keep, and it was beautiful. Where are you all watching this video from, and at what time? Let me know in the comments. And question, if you found out your greatest enemy was actually being manipulated by someone you trusted, would you forgive them or walk away forever? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Lily Calm Stories family for more tales of mystery and truth.